these over the next hour or so. I think there'll be a chance for questions and things to come up at the end too, so that I welcome those. I'm with a nonprofit society called the Hope Mountain Center. I'm program director. I think I've been that for about 11 or 12 years now. And I just wanted to know what Hope Mountain Center does. Our core value is education, and in particular outdoor education. So we get people out hiking and snowshoeing throughout the year. We have paddle trips on the Fraser. We run bird blitzes. If you're a bird watcher, we run some really fun birding events in the spring. So we're getting people outside doing outdoor programs, but we also do conservation. So we've done some riparian planting, and we've got a grizzly bear hotline and a black bear education committee. We run school programs. So in our school district, we reach kids from kindergarten to grade 6 with all sorts of outdoor education. We take them camping in the Skagit. Oh gosh, there's a bunch of other stuff we do. Anyway, we're busy people. And the other thing we do on top of all of that is we build trails. We build and maintain about 24 trails in the Hope area, just because we know that good trails mean people are going to get out into nature. So good transportation through the woods is a great way to get people outside. So we've really taken a leadership role in the Hope area of reopening trails and maintaining the ones that we have, as well as building new ones. And since 2009, we've been working on the Hudson Bay Company Trail. So during this talk today, I want to give you a bit of a sense of the history of the trail, but also maybe inspire you to get out there and explore parts of it too, because we've really built a beautiful trail. You can hike it in a multi-day backpacking adventure if you want, but you can also go out there and just do little forays. You can do little day trips to different segments of that trail using the logging road network that exists. And so I hope to get some of you excited about maybe doing that and getting out and exploring the HBC. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint show going here. Can everybody see that?
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yes, can you, you're interfering with the presentation, Don.
Well, I can't get the picture.
Are you on your phone?
Yes.
You give me a phone call, okay? And I'll take you out, yeah.
Is everybody seeing that okay? Can you see the picture?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, as you can see, it's a 74-kilometer trail from Hope to Tulameen. That's the particular segment that we've restored. But as you'll see in the presentation, it was part of a much larger continental trail network. And I want to start off by beginning at Fort Hope. Here's a picture of Hope in 1860. And its origins really were, first of all, it was a Stalo village called Sakals, and was one of several villages in this part of the Fraser River. And of course, in Stalo territory from roughly Yale to the Salish Sea, it's estimated that pre-contact there was about 60,000 Stalo people living in permanent villages up and down the Fraser River from Yale to the Salish Sea at Musqueam. So an amazing culture, an amazing history there on the Fraser. And you can still see, if you look at the far right-hand corner of that photo there, you can still see a split cedar plank First Nations longhouse sitting right next to the Hudson Bay Company fort. So it's kind of neat to have that First Nations history right in that photo there, in that 1860 photo. And if you're wondering,
excuse me, I'm sorry, I can see you, but I can't see the photo. I don't know what we're looking at.
Oh, okay. Is anyone else seeing the slideshows that I'm showing you?
No.
Nobody's seeing them?
No one's seeing it? Okay.
No.
I thought I had.
No.
Okay, hang on a sec. Thought I had gone to share screen there. Oh, maybe I didn't. Can you see that now?
Yep. Fort Hope.
There
Is that what you're showing us, Fort Hope?
Let's start again.
Okay.
There you go. Do you see that new title slide?
Yes, yes, I do now. Thank you.
Oh, great. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Beginning there. There's just a nice scenic view from one of the mountain meadows that the trail crosses. And as I said, it's 74 kilometers from Hope to Tulameen. And so I want to start in Hope. And there's that image, that historic picture from 1860 that I was hoping you'd all see. And in the far right end of that shot of the community, there's that Stalo longhouse that you can see. And so, you know, the village of Sakals would have had at least a couple of hundred members in that community, but it was one of dozens and dozens of villages up and down the Fraser, as I mentioned. And in terms of the Hudson's Bay Company fort, you can actually see the flagpole just to the left of that First Nations longhouse. 2 buildings over, you can see the front porch of the HBC trading post and the flagpole that would have carried the HBC sign or the HBC flag. Same emblem that you see in the bottom right-hand or left-hand corner of this image. And of course, they're one of the oldest corporations on earth, founded in 1670 and still
Now,
operating today.
Is that where Hope is today? It says Fort Hope. Is that Hope?
Yeah, that's a shot of Hope from 1860.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. By the time this photo was taken, of course, the gold rush was in full bloom. And so there was, 30,000 American miners coming up the river to places like Hope and Yale and completely transforming the landscape and, transforming the culture and history of British Columbia, of course, in doing so. And the history that I'm looking at today is really the period from 1849, well, let's say the early 1800s and the early days of the fur trade west of the Rockies. It really started around 1805 up there in Fort St. James, and leading up to this year of 1860, because once the gold rush came, really the fur trade was very much disrupted. First Nations life was very much disrupted. And so we're entering, by 1860, you're entering into the colonial period in British Columbia, which is a very different time than the time of the fur trade. So I want you to imagine a time before the gold rushes, when really there was a few hundred European fur traders operating on a land base that was absolutely massive, from present-day Alaska down to California. The Hudson's Bay Company had a tremendous hold on the landscape there in terms of commercial activity. But really, they were plugged into a much larger population of First Nations people who did most of the work and helped to create a lot of the wealth in that fur trade. And as I hope to demonstrate too, it was something that was mutually beneficial to both cultures. And in that sense, it's very different than the gold rushes that came later. The gold rushes were very disruptive to First Nations autonomy on the land and very disruptive to their cultures. But the fur trade kind of plugged in quite nicely and actually brought very valuable commodities into their territories, which they traded with their neighbors and grew wealthy from. So that's one of the things I like about fur trade history. It's the earliest encounters between First Nations and Europeans. And it was not, such a destructive and disruptive time as the colonial period that came later. Here's why Fort Hope was so important. Just as today, when you drive through Hope today, it's full of gas stations and motels and hotels because it's a real transportation hub. And back in the early 1800s, Fort Langley used the Fraser. Oh, pardon me, I'm just going to turn off that phone. Sorry about that. This is a boat used by the folks in Fort Langley. It was called a bateau. That was the French word for it. It was also known as a York boat. And this is why Hope was so strategically important. It was sitting there right beside the Fraser River. So it was sort of a natural getting off point where the goods that were coming over the mountains could be loaded onto these boats and sent downriver to Langley. Or likewise, men and materials could come upriver on these boats and resupply those forts. And so Hope was that transfer point where we transferred back and forth between land-based transportation and water-based transportation. Because at the time, of course, roads and trails were quite limited, and the Fraser River constituted really the most important roadway or highway in British Columbia at that time. So there's a York boat, and it's full of historic reenactors. Look at those guys all in costume. They're a Langley-based organization by and large, and they're the ones who built this beautiful replica of a bateau or a York boat. And there's Fort Langley, of course, a really important fur trade fort, the first one established on the Fraser River. I think it was 1827 when the original fort was built. And this is another important fort that was part of this whole network. And this is one of the really crucial inland forts. This is Fort Kamloops. Again, a photo taken around the early 1860s by the time of the gold rush. But this is a crucial fort because this is where they bred hundreds and hundreds of horses. In this photo, you can see in the large horse paddocks that are based there at the fort. They had to raise hundreds of animals and maintain hundreds of animals every year because they were so crucial to the transport of furs and also supplies and other material that had to move inland every year. So in terms of outbound brigades, these horse brigades carried furs to the coast via Fort Hope and Fort Langley, ultimately loaded onto ships that were sent around the world. But then, of course, these trails and forts also were important for the resupply of all of the other far-flung forts in the HBC Empire, and the horses were a crucial part to do it. So Kamloops, with that wonderful rangeland, grasslands everywhere, lots of open country, great place to raise horses for those horse brigades. Just want to pull back for a minute, and you can see in this map here a map showing Fort Hope on the western side, on the left-hand edge there. You can see it beside the Fraser River. And then a lot of you guys are familiar with Princeton, and so if you look to the far right of this image, you can see the town of Princeton there, originally called Vermilion Forks. And just to the northwest of Princeton, you can also see Tulameen, also known as Otter Flats at the southern end of Otter Lake. I don't know if many of you guys have ever visited Tulameen, but it's a pretty little town that you can still visit today. And so the piece of trail that Hope Mountain Center has worked to restore is really that section 74 kilometers from Fort Hope to Tulameen. But of course, it was part of a much larger trail network. Just worth taking a look too at the other trails in the area. Hey, it's amazing. Hope is such a transportation hub. Look at all the railways and historic trails that emanated or terminated at Fort Hope over the years. It's just always been at the center of British Columbia's transportation history. Of course, we've always had a really huge economic and social need to cross those rugged mountains just east of Hope. And so there it is. Hope is sort of the stopping off point, both historically and today. But if we pull back even farther, you can see what a large-scale continental story this trail is really part of. The Hudson Bay Company really had exclusive commercial domain west of the Rockies in the early 1800s, starting with those northern forts, Fort Fraser, Fort St. James, Fort McLeod, Fort George, which is now Prince George. Those northern forts were the first ones to be built around 1805, 1806, 1808, depending on the fort. But the north was particularly valuable in terms of the furs there. The furs were of a very high quality. Any guesses? Can anyone suggest why the northern forts had the best fur? I'll answer it for you. It's because it's bloody cold. And if you're a fur-bearing mammal, a warm-blooded fur-bearing mammal in the far north, you're going to have the best, densest, most plush fur on Earth to be able to survive those absolutely brutal northern winters. So this is the highest value fur that the Hudson Bay Company had, was all of these northern forts. But the problem they had, of course, was trying to get those furs to market. For the first couple of decades, they actually sent them all the way back overland to Montreal, if you can believe it. These initial forts were actually opened by the Northwest Company, which was later taken over by the HBC. But their headquarters was in Montreal, and imagine having to load up all those furs and send them in a huge set of canoe trips and portages all the way back to the Great Lakes and ultimately to Montreal. That's like thousands of kilometers, and it was a really horrendous journey that they had to make a couple of times a year to get all those furs to market. Nonetheless, it only took a single loaded boat full of furs to reach Montreal to pay for the entire salary of the Northwest Company. So it gives you an idea of how low the rate of pay was for the average voyageur that was working for them, but also what an incredible profit they could make. So if the first boat that you got to Montreal paid for your staff, every other additional boat you had after that was going to easily cover the cost of trade goods and materials and give you a handsome profit as well. So there's a lot of money to be made in the fur trade. But certainly it was probably not going to be a sustainable business if they couldn't find an easier way to get their product to market. So by the early to mid 1800s, they had found a much better route going south. Instead of going all the way to Montreal, they put their furs onto boats at Fort George. They went downriver to Fort Alexandria, and you can see it in the map that I'm showing you here. And then at Fort Alexandria, that's where they would transfer off of the boats and get all the furs loaded onto the backs of horses. And they'd bring those horses down to Fort Kamloops. They had a variety of routes that they took over the years, but basically the job was to get those horses to Fort Kamloops. And then from Fort Kamloops, they would travel down Okanagan Lake, and they would get into the Columbia River at Fort Okanagan. And then they would bring the furs all the way down the main stem of the Columbia on those bateaux, those York boats that I showed you, all the way down to Fort Vancouver. You can see it there, just about 100 miles inland from the mouth of the Columbia River in what is today Washington State and Oregon. So it's an amazing geographical story. Eh? Like what a humongous journey to get all of those furs down to Fort Vancouver at the mouth of the Columbia. But having done so, they could, of course, load them onto ships, get them out to international markets. And that was really what saved the fur trade west of the Rockies. If they hadn't succeeded in finding this route to the ocean, they would not have flourished, and they would have eventually probably retreated to the east side of the Rockies. In the years that followed, of course, they established Fort Victoria, Fort Langley, and eventually, in 1846, the Canada-U.S. border was established after negotiations between the Americans and the British. And so at that point, the British really lost access to the lower Columbia. So you can imagine their panic, right? They had forts down there, Fort Okanagan, you can see Fort Colville, Fort Vancouver. They had to abandon those forts. Eventually, they ran for a couple of more years under the HBC. But effectively, they had to retreat to the north side of the border. And then suddenly the pressure was on. How are we going to get these furs to the ocean? The first attempt they made was to connect from Fort Kamloops to Fort Yale. You can see Yale there just upriver from Hope. That was in 1848-49. They lost 70 horses. One guy committed suicide. They lost dozens of loads of furs, which really made the Scottish managers of the HBC very angry because they were frugal Scotsmen. And the thought of losing furs, I mean, losing a man would be one thing, but to actually lose product and lose profit was unbearable. So they abandoned that route and luckily for us found a better route via Fort Hope. So that piece that I just showed you earlier, this section from Fort Hope to Tulameen and then north to Fort Kamloops became the official route from 1849 to 1860. And the good news for all of us is it was a success. It allowed the fur trade to flourish for another decade or more. They were able to bring those furs across and they were able to resupply all the forts on the interior and keep their operations going. And who knows what Canada would look like today if this fur trade hadn't succeeded. If they'd pulled back to the east side of the Rockies, it's hard to imagine a world where British Columbia didn't really become part of the United States. And Governor Douglas, the head of the HBC in North America at the time, or not North America, but on the West Coast at least, he was stationed at Fort Victoria, there he is there. He understood the importance of it. He said, "It is a great relief to have established the practicability of this route to the interior through the formidable barrier of mountains which separates it from Fraser's River. And while it will have the effect of imparting a greater degree of confidence in our own operations, it may also have an important bearing on the future destinies of the country. A triumph, probably the last of the kind reserved for the fur trade." So Governor Douglas had been there when we lost Oregon, when the British lost the Oregon Territory to the Americans. And he knew that British Columbia was also potentially susceptible to that evolution of it becoming American. So he understood very clearly that the success of the fur trade on this new trail from Fort Hope to Fort Kamloops was basically going to allow the British fur trade to continue west of the Rockies. And therefore, as he accurately predicted, it was probably going to keep this part of North America under British domain. And there's a loaded fur brigade heading over the mountains. You can imagine what kind of a rugged, difficult life it was. The lifespan of the average HBC employee was 45 years. Amazing that, eh? It means all of us are basically living on borrowed time right now if we were HBC employees. And it was hard on the horses too. Dozens of them died during various crossings over the years, sometimes from weather, other times just malnutrition and exhaustion, or it might be an infected foot. None of them had horseshoes at this time. So they were just basically going on their natural hooves, carrying incredibly heavy loads. So they would have up to 180 pounds of material on their backs when they're making these mountain crossings. So it was hard on the men, hard on the horses. And it's important perhaps that we don't overly romanticize this era because I think it would have been a tough time to be alive. And there's an overnight camp on one of the HBC trails. You can see they've got canvas up everywhere, canvas tents, oil impregnated canvas, keeping the furs and trade goods dry and protected. And every day they had to load and unload hundreds of horses to get ready to make another part of the crossing as they headed over those mountains. And of course, native involvement was very crucial too. Natives formed an important part of the workforce. They often went on hunting forays ahead of the brigades. And so they would be a couple of kilometers out in front of the brigade hunting for grouse, marmot, deer, moose, if they could get it, bear, if they could get it. And then that meat would help to feed the brigades as they crossed the mountains. But as I mentioned, First Nations also grew wealthy in trade goods because the HBC had really valuable things to trade. And in exchange for those furs, they had guns and powder and shot, so First Nations could could hunt more effectively in their territories using British firearms. But also imagine the value of a metal cooking pot or a tea kettle or an axe, a steel axe head. These are really valuable trade goods, tobacco, all kinds of amenities, copper wire, thread, needles, really practical, durable goods that First Nations would use themselves and also trade with their neighbors, with neighboring First Nations, and they'd grow wealthy trading, in salmon and some of the traditional trade goods that First Nations had been trading with each other for centuries. Now they had these British trade goods, which they could then convert into other valuable trade items that they wanted. So this is what I'm speaking about, I guess, in terms of the difference between the fur trade and colonialism. This was a time of really close cooperation between Europeans and First Nations. There was, a lot of intermarriage, a lot of strategic relationships developed between the fur forts and the neighboring bands that lived nearby. And the native bands themselves would help to protect the fort because they had a vested interest in the survival of the fort. They would protect it from attack from other neighboring First Nations who might try and take it over and take the trade goods themselves. They would it was called the home guard. So having a native village near your fur fort was a good practical advantage for the HBC too. And so having positive relations with First Nations was actually crucial to their survival, crucial to the flourishing of the trade. Here's a great example from a HBC employer or explorer named A.C. Anderson. He crossed the Cascades looking for that route between Fort Hope and Kamloops. And luckily for him, near Princeton, or near Tulameen, I should say, he bumped into a native chief named Black Eye. And Black Eye showed him his favorite hunting route to get from the east to the west over a plateau called the Tulameen Plateau. And you can see that dashed red line running diagonally across the map. Underneath it, A.C. Anderson notes in 1846, Indian Horse Road recommended by Black Eye. So it was because of First Nations knowledge of the land, the HBC were helped in finding the most efficient trade route. On the left-hand side of that map, you can see part of the dangerous part of the Tulameen Canyon marked in yellow. And A.C. Anderson notes that the canyon was impassable to horses. He went in there exploring and realized, no, there's no way we can bring loaded fur brigades through this canyon. But thanks to Black Eye, he learned about the Tulameen Plateau and taking this big shortcut across the plateau. And I'll show you some pretty pictures of that plateau a little bit later. So again, examples of the close cooperation and mutual dependency that European fur traders had with First Nations. And of course, they were plugging into a pre-existing native economy that had been around for thousands of years. Native people were already very experienced hunters and trappers. They knew their territory. They had relationships with other neighboring First Nations. So they were very helpful to the HBC in terms of helping them succeed in a very difficult environment. And over the years, the HBC Trail hosted a lot of different celebrities. There's A.C. Anderson in the upper left-hand corner. But running left to right, we've got Donald Manson. Manson's Ridge and Manson's Camp are named after him. He was one of the important chief traders of the company. Rather brutal fellow. He was noted for his use of the cane and other weaponry to discipline his troops or his employees. There was no HR department back then, and if you fell in trouble with your managers, they might very well use something called club law, as it was referred to in the days of the HBC, and it was a corporal punishment approach to employee discipline. The next guy over, Paul Fraser, was infamous for having actually killed a man in Fort St. James. He actually beat him to death over some infraction committed by the staff person. And that created a lot of hostility toward Paul Fraser among the rank and file members of his employees, among his staff. And he was actually killed on the Hudson Bay Company Trail just east of Hope in a camp called Deer Camp by a tree that had been felled upon his tent by his own employees. And it was officially billed as an accident back in the day in 1855 when it happened. But there's a lot of speculation that that was not an accidental dropping of a tree, that they were actually seeking to end him. There's Donald McLean. He looks like a member of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. So that's a picture of him in the 1860s. He went on to eventually leave the HBC, and during the gold rush, he started the Hat Creek Ranch. Some of you may have visited Hat Creek Ranch over the years. Well, that was started by Donald McLean. He infamously lost 70 horses during a snowstorm on the HBC Trail, just on the eastern side of Manson's Ridge, an October snowstorm came in and suddenly dropped a meter or more of snow on the ground in a matter of hours, and 70 horses perished and starved to death and were killed by the cold up on the Manson's Ridge there. And there's Lieutenant Palmer, a Royal Engineer who came over in 1859 with the British Expeditionary Force that was there to establish law and order in the colony after the 1858 gold rush broke out. He hiked the entire HBC trail and left behind the best written record that we have of that trail. It's been very helpful to the people who came later who relocated the trail, having his notes. Matthew Begbie, I'm sure many of you have heard of Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie. He traveled the HBC trail in 1859 with Lieutenant Palmer on his way to some of the interior communities that had sprung up during the gold rush to maintain law and order in those communities. And lastly, Podunk Davis, his name appears on a lot of the place names of the HBC. There's Mount Davis, there's Podunk Creek, and he's just a really neat character, a placer miner and trapper who had a series of cabins in the area and would help to rescue lost people who were lost on the trail. And he actually in the 1930s got very involved in relocating the HBC trail too, so he played a role in keeping the memory of the trail alive. But he knew the country in the mountains east of Hope really well. Real character. He made really good moonshine whiskey apparently too. He was originally from Kentucky, and he knew how to make Kentucky moonshine. So lastly, I want to just give you guys a sense of what we've done to reopen the trail. Starting in 2009, we've put in directional signs. We put kilometer markers on all the important kilometer points along the route so people can stay on the trail and know where they are. And this gives you an idea of what the route looks like in terms of topography. And I guess this is a warning to you all, because look at the incredible elevation gain and loss crossing the Cascade Mountains from Hope to Tulameen. It's insane. You can see that we've got 10 overnight camps on the route. We tried to keep every camp no more than about 10 kilometers apart, often less than that, just so that people, especially in the high topography zones, we wanted to give people a camp that was always 10 kilometers or less to go in a day, just because the elevation gain and loss was pretty taxing. But yeah, it looks kind of like a heart rate, doesn't it? A heart rate monitor there. Believe it or not, people actually run this trail. There's extreme trail runners who start in Tulameen and they run the entire 74-kilometer route from Tulameen to Hope in a single day. A lady just set a new women's record this summer, and she was just over 12 hours of continuous running. So there's the trailhead at Pierce Creek, a bridge over the Pierce Creek drainage there, and we start heading up the Pierce Creek Valley toward the first overnight camp, which is Manson's camp. And at all of our camps, we built benches and tables and fire rings, and we've got a bear-proof food cache and a toilet and all the practical things that you'd need at each of those camps. And also, at every historic camp, we've also put in interpretive signs. So we're telling some of the dramatic stories of things that happened at that particular location of the HBC trail. So people have come away not just with a hiking experience, but with a richer picture of BC history and the importance of this trail. And that's looking from Manson's Ridge back toward Fort Hope. So you can see Kakwa Lake. You can see a curve of the Fraser River there, and you can see some of the buildings of Fort Hope sitting beside the Fraser. So it's kind of neat when you're going up Pierce Creek, you look back at Hope almost perfectly due west, like this valley is perfectly aligned with downtown Hope, so that if you're a Hudson's Bay Company employee sitting in Fort Hope and you knew you wanted to cross the mountains, if you looked immediately to the east, you would look up Pierce Creek. The valley is excellently aligned, and it's no surprise that they chose that particular valley to start heading east out of town. As you cross over Manson's Ridge, you're into some beautiful old-growth hemlock and amabilis fir forest with yellow cedar, typical kind of mountain forest that you find on the coast, including North Vancouver and those kind of areas. And as you head into the Upper Sewakwa, you come down off of Manson's Ridge, you get into the valley bottom of the Upper Sewakwa, and there's these huge skunk cabbage colonies in there, and the HBC employees really dreaded these sections of the Sewakwa. They referred to them as buoy beers, which was a mixture of French and Old English, and it basically meant mud coffins. These heavily laden horses would be up to their bellies in the mud, and it was quite a difficult section for them to manage. But over time, the HBC employees drained some of these boggy areas and put corduroy road decking down on top of the mud so the horses would have more easy transfer across the mud. But now, of course, 170 plus years later, all that corduroy is rotted away and we're back to the mud. So the backpackers have quite a time running through these mud coffins on their summer journey. But it builds a lot of empathy for the HBC, and the horses. You're always thinking about their physical suffering that they must have gone through as you are suffering with a backpack on your back. As you climb out of the Upper Suwako, you get into some beautiful alpine meadows. This is on Mount Davis, named after Podunk Davis, that Kentucky moonshiner I introduced you to. So beautiful meadows in full bloom in the summertime. And here you can spend the night at Deer Camp. This is another one of the historic camps, the camp where Paul Fraser was potentially killed by his own employees, that fallen tree on his tent. But today it's a peaceful, beautiful green meadow, and just a great place to spread your tent out and relax with your friends. And there's some more of those beautiful wildflower blooms on Mount Davis. This is a gorgeous little water body along the way, right near the watershed divide between the Fraser and the Columbia rivers. And this is called Palmer's Pond. So it's named after Lieutenant Palmer, the Royal Engineer that I mentioned earlier, who crossed this trail in 1859. That's a beautiful little tarn up there. We've had historic reenactors come and bring the trail back to life for us, carrying their HBC era muskets and period appropriate dress. We celebrated Canada's sesquicentennial with a special hike a few summers back with these historic reenactors, and they had black powder rifles that they fired off in the meadows. It was pretty cool. And there's our hiking group that we led on for Canada's sesquicentennial, and that's Mount Davis in the background. This is another one of the overnight camps. This is Conglomerate Flats Camp. It was not a historic camp in the era of the HBC, but it's one of the additional camps that we built in the modern era, just to give backpackers more options for spending the night along the trail. This is one of the areas you could get to quite easily, actually. You could get right up into this meadow in about 2.5 kilometers distance from the road, and it's only about 250 meters of elevation gain. So if you drove into a place called Jacobson Lake, you could park your car at Jacobson Lake and hike up and be in this meadow, within a couple of hours. But this photo is from a backpacking trip that we led for the general public, going from Hope all the way to Tulameen. So we had to continue on our way. We were traveling east of Jacobson Lake here, and we're into some interior lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce forest, typical interior forest. And Lieutenant Palmer actually mentioned this in his 1859 journal. He noticed how the ecological zones were shifting dramatically from west to east, going from cedar forest on the west coast up and over these mountains and down into the rain shadow of the interior. And he noticed the forest and grasslands really changing. This is another historic camp that we refurbished. This is called Horse Guard Camp. So the HBC brigades would have stayed here, and we made a nice fire ring and benches for everybody there. And you can see another one of those interpretive signs in the background. There's the Horse Guard interpretive sign. And this is an example of the steel bear-proof food caches we've installed at every camp, so you can lock your food up safely overnight. You don't have to worry about bears coming in to attack your tent or your backpack. You can store it all safely in these steel lockers. We also put in really fabulous toilets, and we're quite proud of our toilets because we've always aimed them towards scenic views along the trail. So from various vantage points, you'll look forward to your next visit to an HBC toilet because it's always giving you a fabulous view of the surrounding mountains and meadows that you're in. This is a beautiful feature called the Defiles. This is something that backpackers travel through on their way up to the Tulameen Plateau. When you get to the plateau, we've got a camp that we named after Black Eye, the First Nations chief who showed A.C. Anderson the route over the Tulameen Plateau. And this camp is sitting on the Tulameen Plateau, so we thought it was an appropriate place to thank Chief Black Eye for sharing that knowledge with the HBC. And that's what the Tulameen Plateau looks like today. It's just a beautiful complex of forest and meadow. In the HBC back in the day, they called it the Garden of Eden because it was wonderful. It was easy travel for the horses, and there was lots of forage, so the horses could feed themselves as they were traveling the route. That mixture of meadow and forest was great for the horses. The Garden of Eden. And eventually you'll get to Jacobson Lake. It's on the Tulameen Plateau, and it's a pretty little lake that you can camp beside on your journey. That was another historic camp where the HBC actually stayed. And this is the Olivine Ridge. So we're getting closer and closer to Tulameen now. This is about day 6 of our journey back in 2016 when we led this trip. And this is Olivine Camp, another friendly little cozy camp. Lots of sheltered timber nearby, but very close to the meadows. So you can, after you've had dinner at this camp, you can happily leave your backpack behind and just go for a nice little evening stroll out on the Olivine Ridge and get beautiful views. Not far from camp. Now we're getting really close to Tulameen. We're dropping down off the Olivine Ridge and heading down toward the Tulameen River. And that's just near the trailhead across the river. We put up this really big HBC trail sign so that when people stop and park across the river, they can actually see where they have to head to find the trail. But this is now, I guess this was day 8 after a 7-night journey on the HBC trail. That we took our time on this trip. Lots of people do it in 3 or 4 days, but we decided to do it in 7 nights, 8 days, just so we'd have more time to stop and smell the roses and enjoy little side trips and stuff on the trail too. So that was a fun trip. And that's that's the parking area across the river. So you can see that on the eastern end at Tulameen, the first thing you've got to do is take your hiking boots off and walk across the river to get to the HBC trail. And that's the nice kiosk that we built at the eastern end. We've got several of these. We've got one at the Piers Creek trailhead end, and we've got one at Sawakwa, and we've got one here at Tulameen. I just want to thank the people who really made this trail get rediscovered, and first and foremost is Harley Hatfield, but also mapper and engineer Bob Harris played a key role too. And they got lots of people fired up about the trail in the 1960s and 70s, and they led public trips and backpacking journeys for young Boy Scouts. And they did a great job of sort of flagging the route and rediscovering it by digging up old journals from the various travelers of the day. And I know Harley Hatfield even flew back to London to access HBC documents that weren't available in Canada at the time. So a lot of paperwork was done, and also a lot of hard work was done on the trail. And I love that quote from Harley Hatfield: "History should be learned through the soles of our feet." And I really feel that every time I'm on the HBC trail and I'm huffing and puffing with a pack on my back, I'm thinking about those people and those horses and how they, the physical price they paid to move those furs across those mountains and resupply all those forts with inbound brigades full of trade goods and flour and bacon and rum and tobacco and all the things that were needed to keep those forts operating. So these people played a key role in the rediscovery of the trail. And our own volunteers, starting from 2009 to the present day, have put in literally thousands of hours into the trail, and that's really helped us to do more with the money that we have. And it's played a crucial role in the reopening of the trail. Just in recent years, we've published 2 items that are valuable to anybody who wants to explore the trail. On the left is a booklet which really describes the human history of the trail in great detail. So you can learn so much more than I've shared with you today by reading that little booklet. It's designed to be backpack friendly, so it can sort of fit in the lid of your pack and be used to tell stories around the campfire when you're hiking the trail. But on the right, we've got a topographical map printed on waterproof paper that gives you all the information you need to actually plan your trip. So that's sort of your trip planning guide there on the right. It's got a really detailed topographical map inside, and it's got lots of other practical information, telling you about the campsites, where the water supplies are, road distances, detailed directions to find each of the road intersections that intersect the trail here and there. So those are 2 valuable guides. And they're available. Mount Waddington's in Chilliwack carries them. What's the sporting goods store in Abbotsford? Valhalla Pure, they've got it. And then in Hope, a number of retailers do. Baker's Books, the Hope Visitor Center, Hope Outdoors. And you can also order these online via our website if you just want to order online, and we'll mail these to you if you go to the Hope Mountain Center website. And lastly, I just want to thank the funders who helped to make this trail possible. It really belongs to the province of British Columbia, so the Recreation Sites and Trails BC people are the ones that we co-manage the trail with. Hope Mountain Center is sort of the lead organization. So we've signed a partnership agreement with RSTBC, and together we manage the trail. But the backcountry horsemen have played a key role, and a number of other really important funders. The Okanagan-Similkameen Park Society in particular, they go back to the 1970s working with Harley Hatfield to restore the trail. So they've given us some key funding in recent years as well. So thanks to all of those folks. And I think that's it.